At 11:14 on the morning of January 11, 1944, Major James Howard circled his P-51 Mustang 4 miles above Oschersleben, Germany, watching more than 30 German fighters dive towards 60 unprotected B-17s below. 30 years old, 86 combat missions already behind him, flying for the Flying Tigers in China, and only weeks into flying a fighter some in the Army Air Forces, still called too fragile for deep escort work over Germany. The math of the air war that winter was brutal. In the previous months, unescorted bomber losses had run as high as 60 aircraft in a single mission, over targets like Schweinfurt and Regensburg. Black Thursday alone, October 14th, cost 60 B-17s and 600 airmen in one afternoon. The P-51 had entered combat only weeks earlier, with Howard's 354th Fighter Group, the first unit anywhere to fly the Merlin-powered Mustang deep into German airspace. And this January 11th mission was meant to prove the concept could actually protect a bomber stream all the way to target and back. Howard's flight had scattered chasing a separate engagement, and his radio had gone quiet where his wingmen should have been. Below him, Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs pressed in on the 401st Bomb Group at altitude, tearing into a formation carrying roughly 600 American airmen, with no other friendly fighters anywhere in sight. Howard made the decision in seconds. Rather than break off to hunt for his own scattered squadron, he dove alone into a formation of more than 30 enemy fighters. If you want to see how one Mustang held off an entire Luftwaffe formation, hit that like button. It helps us bring you more stories like this one. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Howard. He came down out of the sun at speed, guns converging on the nearest fighter, before the German pilot ever registered the threat. His first burst connected, and the aircraft went down trailing smoke. He pulled up hard into a second attack, then a third, working the formation from angles no single defender was supposed to be able to cover. The Mustang's edge in raw speed over both the Messerschmitt and the Focke-Wulf was the only thing keeping him alive, letting him dive, strike, and extend away faster than the Germans could follow, before climbing back to altitude to do it again. Inside the bomber formation, crews watched something none of them had ever seen. A ball turret gunner counted engagement after engagement below the fuselage, the lone Mustang never settling into a defensive pattern, always positioning itself between the bombers and whatever German element looked closest to breaking through. Radio calls asking for the fighter's call sign went unanswered. Howard was far too busy to respond. The fight stretched past 10 minutes, then 20. German pilots, experienced veterans, not green replacements, adjusted their tactics as they came to recognize the pattern. Howard targeted formation leaders first, broke up cohesion, then let the Mustang's speed carry him clear before the group could regroup and bracket him. They tried exactly that, splitting into high and low elements to box him in from 2 directions at once. Howard read the trap and dove through it anyway, catching the high element off guard and forcing German pilots trained to expect rational, textbook responses, to break formation in confusion, at a maneuver that looked closer to reckless than calculated. His ammunition thinned engagement by engagement. Guns began jamming from the extreme temperature swings at altitude, cycling white-hot during rapid bursts, then seizing solid in air pushing 40 below zero. One gun went silent, then a second. Standard doctrine said, disengage the moment weapons started failing, with enemy numbers still in the double digits. Howard kept fighting with whatever guns still answered the trigger, because 30-plus German fighters remained between him and 60 bombers, and there was no one else in the sky to take his place. Fuel burned down with every high-power maneuver. Oxygen pressure dropped, and the cold ate into his hands and judgment in equal measure. The kind of conditions that would have justified breaking for home at almost any point in the fight. He didn't take the option. Even after his guns ran dry entirely, Howard kept diving at German fighters with empty weapons, betting correctly, again and again, that a Mustang boring in at full speed would force a break before any German pilot could be certain the threat was real. It worked more often than it had any right to. Only when American P-47 Thunderbolts finally appeared on the horizon, closing to relieve the overwhelmed escort, did the German formation break off the engagement entirely and turn for home, having lost several fighters confirmed destroyed and taken enough additional damage that the bomber stream had, by any honest accounting, Survived an assault, it should never have survived unescorted. Every single B-17 that Howard had defended made it home. Not one was lost. Howard landed back at RAF Boxted that afternoon, after more than 3 hours in the cockpit, the bulk of it in continuous, high-G combat maneuvering. His crew chief counted dozens of bullet holes across the airframe, several of them 20mm cannon strikes, one round missing a fuel tank by inches. Asked how many German fighters he'd actually destroyed, Howard could only say it was hard to be certain in a fight that chaotic. Official confirmation would later credit him with several confirmed kills that day, with bomber crews independently estimating the number even higher, based on what they'd watched from the formation. Word of the engagement spread through the 9th Air Force within days. 18 separate bomber crews all describing the same lone Mustang fighting alone for over half an hour. None of them able to identify the pilot until mission logs traced it to Howard's aircraft. Lead bomber crews called it the greatest exhibition of flying they'd ever witnessed, and said no medal could really be big enough for it. The Medal of Honor recommendation moved through channels fast by wartime standards, and that June, Lieutenant General Carl Spaatz presented Lieutenant Colonel James Howard with the nation's highest decoration for valor, making him one of only 2 fighter pilots in the entire European theater to receive it during the war. The mission reshaped fighter doctrine outright. Before January 11th, American escort fighters were trained to stay close and defensive, shepherding the bomber stream rather than hunting attackers aggressively. After Howard proved what a single determined pilot could accomplish, against impossible odds, doctrine shifted toward aggressive pursuit. Hunt the enemy, rather than simply escort past him. Within months, the overwhelming majority of 8th Air Force fighter groups had converted to Mustangs, and by spring 1944 bomber loss rates that had approached crippling levels the previous autumn had fallen dramatically. The strategic bombing campaign that had nearly been suspended in 1943, finally able to reach targets deep inside Germany and bring crews home. Howard flew dozens more combat missions before the war ended, finishing as a credited ace across both the Pacific and European theaters combined. Fighter Command changed procedures after his mission, specifically to prevent any pilot from ever again being isolated the way Howard had been. Mutual support, no more solo operations. A policy Howard himself agreed was the right lesson, even though it had been his willingness to break every rule that saved 60 bombers that particular morning. He stayed in uniform after the war, became a Navy and Air Force test pilot, helped shape fighter tactics into the Korean War era, and retired a brigadier general in 1965. He died on March 18, 1995, at 81, and was buried with full honors at Arlington National Cemetery. The lesson every fighter pilot since has trained on traces back to that one morning over Oschersleben. Aggression wins fights. Speed is life. And sometimes, one pilot in the right place at the right moment, refusing every reasonable excuse to disengage, is the difference between 600 men coming home and 600 men who don't. If this story moved you the way it moved us, hit that like button. Everyone tells YouTube to put this story in front of more people. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing stories like this one out of the archive every single week. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from, and if anyone in your family served, we want to hear it. Thanks for watching, and thanks for making sure James Howard doesn't disappear into silence.